The 1970s in Britain were not just about glam rock and disco. Behind the dazzling smiles of our nation's most beloved icons lay shadow and despair. Today, we uncover the heartbreaking true stories of 10 stars who paid the ultimate price for fame. From unexplained accidents to battles with inner demons, their ends were as dramatic as their lives. Make sure to subscribe and share your thoughts below. Stay with us until the very end to hear the chilling secret behind a comedy legend's final bow that was hidden for decades. Marc Bolan. He was the electric warrior who practically invented glam rock, dusting the grey streets of Britain with glitter and magic. Marc Bolan, born Mark Feld, was not just a musician, but a phenomenon that the press dubbed T-Rextasy, comparing the hysteria around him to that of the Beatles. With his corkscrew curls and feather boas, he defined the first half of the 1970s, creating anthems that are still played on the radio today. However, beneath the swagger and the top hats, Mark held a deep, chilling premonition about his own fate. He frequently told friends and family that he did not expect to live to see old age, a shadow that followed him even at the height of his fame. Perhaps the most cruel irony of his life was his relationship with automobiles. Marc Bolan possessed a luxurious collection of vehicles, including a white Rolls-Royce, yet he never sat in the driver's seat. He was terrified of learning to drive, convinced that a car would be the instrument of his departure from this world. Because of this phobia, he relied entirely on others to transport him, believing this caution would keep him safe from the dark vision he saw in his mind. It is heartbreaking to realize that his fear was not paranoia, but a tragic prophecy that he could not escape. On the early morning of September 16, 1977, the King of Glam was returning from a celebration at a restaurant in Mayfair. He was a passenger in a purple Mini 1275 GT, driven by his partner Gloria Jones. They were just miles from his home when tragedy struck on a quiet road in Barnes, southwest London. The car left the road, crashed through a fence, and collided with a large sycamore tree. The impact was severe, and the man who had brought so much color to the world lost his life instantly, just 2 weeks before his 30th birthday. The news shattered the British music industry. Fans who had grown up with his posters on their bedroom walls wept in the streets, unable to comprehend that their idol was gone. At his funeral, fellow icons like David Bowie and Rod Stewart came to pay their final respects, standing in somber silence as a large floral tribute shaped like a swan was displayed. The sycamore tree in Barnes became an instant shrine, a place where pilgrims still travel today to leave tributes to the boy who danced with the stars. His passing marked a symbolic end to the innocent, glittering optimism of the early 1970s. While the aggression of punk rock was beginning to take over the charts, the loss of Bolan felt like the lights being turned off at a wonderful party. He left behind a young son, a catalogue of timeless hits, and a legacy that proves some stars burn too bright to last forever. His tragic end remains one of the most poignant cautionary tales in the history of British rock and roll. Sid Vicious. If Marc Bolan represented the glittery dream of the 70s, then this next figure was the rude awakening. Sid Vicious, born John Simon Ritchie, was the sneering face of the punk revolution, a young man who became famous not for his musical talent, but for his attitude and his ultimate descent into darkness. Joining the Sex Pistols in 1977, he replaced the original bassist not because he could play well, but because he possessed the perfect look of rebellion. With his spiked hair, padlock necklace, and constant sneer, he became the poster boy for a generation that wanted to tear down the establishment. However, behind the leather jacket was a vulnerable, confused young man who was hopelessly searching for a connection in a world that only wanted to exploit his image. His life changed forever when he met an American girl named Nancy Tbungen. Their relationship was intense, volatile, and ultimately catastrophic. They became inseparable, clinging to each other as they fell deeper into a world of dangerous chemical dependency. To the press, they were the Romeo and Juliet of the punk rock world, but behind closed doors, their life was a cycle of despair and reliance on heavy substances. After the Sex Pistols disintegrated during a disastrous tour of America, Sid and Nancy moved to the Chelsea Hotel in New York City, a place famous for harboring artists and eccentrics. It was here, in room 100, that their story moved towards its heartbreaking conclusion, surrounded by a haze of confusion and toxic habits. On the morning of October 12, 1978, the staff at the hotel discovered Nancy lifeless in the bathroom. She had suffered a fatal injury, and Sid was immediately detained by the police. The young musician was in a state of complete shock and incoherence, seemingly unable to remember the events of the previous night due to his heavy intoxication. He was charged with the most serious crime imaginable, the taking of another life. However, friends and historians have debated for decades whether it was an accident, a tragic pact, or a misunderstanding gone wrong. Sid was eventually released on bail, but he was a broken man, haunted by the loss of the only person who truly understood him. Less than 4 months later, on February 2, 1979, Sid attended a small gathering to celebrate his release from prison. He was just 21 years old and had his whole life ahead of him, yet the sorrow he carried was too heavy. That night, he made a fatal error with the substances he consumed. The next morning, his mother found him, but it was too late. He had passed away in his sleep, joining his beloved Nancy in the great unknown. His death marked the definitive end of the initial punk explosion in Britain. The tragedy of Sid Vicious is not just about the loss of a young life, it is a stark reminder of how the music industry can consume its own creations. He was a boy who wanted to be a star, but he lacked the support system to handle the pressure. Instead of help, he found enablers. Instead of guidance, he found chaos. Today, his image is still printed on t-shirts worn by tourists in London, but few stop to think about the sad, lonely boy behind the sneer who never made it to his 22nd birthday. He remains the ultimate cautionary tale of the 1970s, a symbol of wasted youth and the destructive power of fame when it comes without protection. Pete Ham. While some stars of the 1970s fought against chemical dependency or the pressures of fame, others were destroyed by the very people who were sworn to protect them. The story of Pete Ham is arguably the most heartbreaking tale of betrayal in the history of British music. As the leader of the band Badfinger, Pete was a sensitive, incredibly talented songwriter who was handpicked by the Beatles to carry the torch of melodic rock into the new decade. With hits like Day After Day and Baby Blue, the band seemed destined for global superstardom. Pete even co-wrote the ballad Without You, a song that became a #1 hit for Harry Nilsson and later Mariah Carey, generating millions in royalties. However, despite his songs conquering the world, Pete Ham was living in a state of growing financial panic. The villain in this tragedy was a manager named Stan Polly. He was a smooth-talking American businessman who promised to handle the band's finances, setting up complex accounts and companies that the young musicians did not understand. Pete, a trusting soul who only cared about the music, believed that his future was secure. By the spring of 1975, Pete had bought a house in Surrey and was expecting a child with his partner. But when he tried to access his own money to pay the bills, he found that the funds were unreachable. The band had been touring constantly and selling records by the truckload, yet they were penniless. The harsh reality slowly dawned on him. The millions they had earned had vanished into a labyrinth of corruption orchestrated by the man they trusted. The situation became critical in April 1975. Pete attempted to contact his manager, desperate for an explanation and the means to support his growing family, but the calls went unanswered. The pressure on the 27-year-old musician was unbearable. He felt a deep sense of shame and hopelessness, believing he had let everyone down. The industry that should have celebrated his genius had instead stripped him of his dignity. On the night of April 23rd, after an evening of drinking and dwelling on the betrayal, Pete made a tragic decision that would silence his golden voice forever. He was found the next morning in his garage studio, having chosen to leave this world by his own hand. Beside him was a note that revealed the depth of his despair. In his final written words, he expressed that he would not be allowed to love and trust everybody, stating that this was the better option. He also left a scathing final sentence directed at his manager, calling him a soulless individual who was responsible for his fate. It was a devastating end for a man who had brought so much joy to others through his melodies. The tragedy of Badfinger did not end there. The financial ruin caused by the management continued to haunt the surviving members for years. In a grim echo of history, Pete's bandmate and close friend Tom Evans would eventually meet a similar fate years later, unable to cope with the same legal and financial battles. Pete Ham remains a member of the tragic 27 Club, but unlike others who died from excess, he was a victim of corporate greed. His story serves as a permanent, sorrowful reminder to all young artists. Talent is not enough if you do not have control over your own destiny. Richard Beckinsale. While the rock stars of the 1970s were often flirting with danger and living on the edge, our next subject was the wholesome, lovable face of British television. Richard Beckinsale was not a rebel or an outcast. He was the boy with the doe eyes and the gentle smile who charmed the entire nation. Rising to fame in two of the decade's most successful sitcoms, Rising Damp and Porridge, he proved to be a comic genius with a rare ability to make audiences laugh while simultaneously pulling at their heartstrings. As Lenny Godber, the naive prison inmate, he held his own against comedy giants like Ronnie Barker, becoming a household name before he even reached his 30th birthday. To the public, he was the picture of youth and vitality, a rising star with decades of success ahead of him. However, fate had a cruel twist in store that no one, not even his doctors, could have predicted. In early 1979, Richard was working on a new sitcom called Bloomers. Outwardly, he appeared fit and healthy, maintaining a busy schedule of filming and family life with his wife, Judy Lowe, and their 5-year-old daughter, Kate. Yet, in the days leading up to the tragedy, he had complained of feeling unusually tired and experiencing some aches in his arms, symptoms that were dismissed as simple fatigue from overworking. He even joked about his health with colleagues, unaware that his body was hiding a silent, deadly condition. On his final day on set, he was his usual cheerful self, bringing laughter to the crew before heading home for what should have been a restful night. On the morning of March 19, 1979, the unthinkable happened. Richard did not wake up. He had passed away in his sleep from a massive heart attack, caused by a congenital defect that had gone undetected for his entire life. He was just 31 years old. The news hit Britain like a physical blow. It seemed impossible that someone so young, who had been making millions laugh on their television screens just days before, was gone. The shock was compounded by the bitter irony that he played the youthful counterpart to older characters in his shows, yet he was the one who was taken first. The outpouring of grief was immense. His co-star and mentor, Ronnie Barker, was reportedly devastated, unable to speak to the press for days due to his sorrow. The tragedy left a void in British comedy that was never quite filled. Perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of his sudden departure was the family he left behind. His young daughter, Kate Beckinsale, would grow up to become a Hollywood superstar, carrying her father's legacy forward, though she has often spoken of the profound loss of losing him at such a tender age. Richard Beckinsale's death remains one of the most poignant moments of the 1970s entertainment world. He didn't die from the excesses of the rock and roll lifestyle or a high-speed crash. He was simply stolen away by nature in the prime of his life. His reruns still air on television today, keeping his memory alive, but watching them brings a bittersweet feeling. We see a young man full of life and promise, frozen in time, reminding us that tomorrow is never promised, no matter how bright the future looks. Keith Moon. In the pantheon of rock and roll excess, one name stands above all others as the undisputed king of chaos. Keith Moon, the drummer for The Who, was not just a musician, he was a force of nature. Known to the public as Moon the Loon, he was famous for driving cars into swimming pools, destroying hotel rooms with explosives, and living life at a speed that terrified ordinary people. Behind the drum kit, he was a genius, playing with a ferocity that defined the sound of the British invasion. However, the Clown Prince of Rock used his eccentric behavior to mask a deep, crippling insecurity and a severe reliance on alcohol to function socially. By the late 1970s, the party was beginning to wind down, and the toll on his body was becoming painfully visible. By 1978, Keith was just 32 years old, yet he looked decades older. He had gained significant weight and was struggling to keep up with the physical demands of his own music. Desperate to get his life back on track and marry his fiancée, Annette, he decided to fight his demons. He wanted to get sober. To assist with this difficult journey, a doctor prescribed him a powerful sedative called heminivrin, intended to curb the craving for alcohol. The tragedy lies in the fact that Keith was trying to save himself, But the very medicine meant to be his cure became his undoing. He was a man of extremes, and he did not understand that taking more of the medication would not make him better faster. Instead, it would prove fatal. On the evening of September 6, 1978, Keith attended a party hosted by Paul McCartney to celebrate the legacy of Buddy Holly. Guests later recalled that Keith seemed different. He was relatively calm and told friends he was planning to settle down. After the event, he returned to the flat he was renting in Mayfair. This location, number 12 Curzon Place, already held a dark reputation in the music world. It was owned by singer Harry Nilsson, and 4 years earlier, the Mamas and the Papas star Cass Elliot had passed away in the exact same bedroom. Keith took a handful of his prescribed tablets, hoping to suppress his anxiety and get some sleep. He never woke up. The official verdict ruled his passing as accidental. He had taken 32 tablets, a lethal dose that overwhelmed his system. The irony was heartbreaking. The man who had survived years of reckless driving, high falls, and dangerous stunts died from a prescription drug while trying to get clean. His death devastated his bandmates, particularly Pete Townshend, and effectively ended the classic era of The Who. The rhythm section that had powered the mod generation was silenced forever. The story of Keith Moon is often retold as a series of funny anecdotes about smashed guitars and hovercrafts, but the ending is profoundly sad. It reveals the loneliness of the class clown who feels he must always perform, even when he is hurting inside. The spooky coincidence of his death occurring in the same room as Cass Elliot led Harry Nilsson to sell the property, convinced it was cursed. Today, Keith is remembered as the greatest drummer in rock history, a wild comet that burned out because the world was simply too small to contain his energy. Sandy Denny. In a decade dominated by loud guitars and aggressive rock stars, there was one voice that possessed a haunting, ethereal quality capable of silencing a rowdy crowd in seconds. Sandy Denny was widely considered the preeminent British folk rock singer, a woman with a talent so immense that she remains the only guest vocalist to ever appear on a Led Zeppelin studio album. With her band Fairport Convention, and later as a solo artist, she wrote songs like Who Knows Where the Time Goes, which displayed a wisdom and melancholy far beyond her years. To her fans, she was an Earth Mother figure, a symbol of pastoral beauty and artistic purity. However, the reality of her daily existence was a turbulent storm of insecurity and self-destruction that stood in stark contrast to the serenity of her music. Sandy struggled immensely with the pressures of the music industry. She was plagued by deep-seated doubts about her appearance and her worth, fears that she attempted to drown in an ocean of liquid courage. Her chaotic lifestyle became legendary within the London music scene, but it was not the glamour of rock and roll. It was a cry for help. By the late 1970s, her behavior had become erratic, driving a wedge between her and her friends and putting a strain on her marriage to fellow musician Trevor Lucas. Despite the birth of her daughter Georgia in 1977, Sandy could not escape the dark clouds that followed her. She was a fragile soul trying to navigate a world that demanded strength she did not possess. The sequence of events leading to her demise is truly tragic because it was so preventable. In March 1978, while on holiday in Cornwall with her family, Sandy suffered a fall down a staircase. She hit her head on the stone floor, but, perhaps due to her state or a fear of doctors, she did not seek immediate medical attention. She believed she had simply bruised herself and carried on, unaware that a ticking time bomb had been set off inside her. Weeks later, back in London, the headaches began to intensify, but the severity of the situation went unnoticed amidst the general chaos of her life. Her husband, fearing for the safety of their child due to Sandy's unpredictable moods, had left for Australia with their daughter, leaving Sandy alone in a friend's home. On April 17, 1978, Sandy was found unconscious at a friend's house. She had collapsed into a coma from which she would never wake. The fall in Cornwall had caused a traumatic brain injury that slowly worsened over time. She passed away 4 days later at the Atkinson Morley Hospital in Wimbledon. She was only 31 years old. The tragic irony was that she sang so often about the passage of time and the fleeting nature of life, yet she was denied the chance to see her own daughter grow up. Her funeral was a somber affair, attended by the royalty of the British folk scene who were left reeling from the loss. For years, her death was whispered about as a warning against the dangers of excess. But today, we recognize it as a heartbreaking failure of support for a woman who gave so much to the world. Sandy Denny left behind a catalog of music that sounds as fresh and painful today as it did 50 years ago. She was a shooting star who fell to earth, a victim of a simple accident that turned fatal because there was no one there to catch her. Her epitaph reads, "The Lady, a simple title for a complex woman whose voice still echoes in the halls of music history." Leslie Harvey. When we think of the dangers facing rock stars in the 1970s, we usually imagine fast cars, private jets, or illicit substances. However, for one talented Scottish musician, the danger was lurking in the very tools of his trade. Leslie Harvey was the gifted guitarist for the blues rock band Stone the Crows, a group that was tipped for massive international success. Managed by the legendary Peter Grant, the same man who guided Led Zeppelin to global domination, the band possessed a raw, gritty sound that was perfectly suited to the era. Leslie was not just a musician, he was the heartbeat of the group and the romantic partner of the band's powerhouse vocalist, Maggie Bell. Together, they were an electric duo, captivating audiences with their chemistry and passion. The tragedy occurred on a rainy evening on May 3, 1972, at the Top Rank Ballroom in Swansea, Wales. The band was preparing to perform for a packed house of eager fans. In those days, the technical side of rock and roll was often a chaotic affair. Safety regulations were loose, equipment was often modified by amateurs, and the grounding of electrical gear was frequently overlooked. As the band took to the stage for their sound check and setup, the atmosphere was buzzing with anticipation. Leslie, with his guitar strapped around his shoulder, walked up to a microphone stand to make an announcement, or perhaps to adjust his position. It was a routine action he had performed 1,000 times before. In a horrifying instant, the circuit was completed. Due to a fault in the ungrounded equipment, a high-voltage current surged through the metal strings of his guitar and the microphone. Leslie was electrocuted in front of his bandmates and the gathering crowd. At first, there was confusion. Some audience members reportedly thought it was a dramatic stunt, a part of the performance designed to shock them. But the reality was far more grim. His fellow musicians and the road crew rushed to help him, frantically trying to break the connection, but the electrical force was too strong. By the time he was freed and rushed to the hospital, it was too late. Leslie Harvey was pronounced deceased at the tragic age of 27. The impact of this event on the British music community was profound. It highlighted the terrifying lack of safety standards in venues across the country. A young man with the world at his feet had been taken away simply because of a loose wire and a wet stage. For Maggie Bell and the rest of Stone the Crows, the loss was insurmountable. They attempted to continue with a replacement guitarist, but the heart had been ripped out of the band. The grief was too heavy, and the group eventually dissolved, leaving behind a legacy of what might have been. Leslie Harvey is often remembered as a member of the 27 Club, but unlike others who courted danger, he was an innocent victim of negligence. His story is a chilling reminder of the physical perils of the golden age of rock. Every time a modern musician steps on stage with safe, wireless equipment, they owe a small debt to the tragedies of the past that forced the industry to change. Leslie's final chord was never played, but the silence he left behind still resonates as one of the most freakish and sorrowful accidents in music history. Paul Kossoff. In the history of British rock, there are guitarists who play fast, and then there are guitarists who play with their soul. Paul Kossoff was undoubtedly the latter. As the lead guitarist for the band Free, he was a child prodigy who possessed a vibrato so emotional and distinct that it could make a grown man cry. The son of the beloved actor David Kossoff, Paul was a sensitive, artistic young man who found his voice through the strings of his Les Paul guitar. When the band released their global anthem, All Right Now, in 1970, Paul was just barely out of his teens, yet he was already being hailed as a master of the blues. However, while the music was triumphant, the man behind the instrument was crumbling under the weight of his own sensitivity. Unlike the hedonistic partying of his peers, Paul's descent into chemical dependency was driven by a deep, aching sadness. He struggled immensely with the pressures of touring and the internal conflicts that eventually tore the band Free apart. When the group dissolved, Paul took it as a personal rejection, a heartbreak from which he never truly recovered. He began to self-medicate with powerful sedatives, substances that numbed his pain but slowly destroyed his coordination and his health. It was a painful sight for his friends to watch. The man who once made his guitar sing could sometimes barely hold a plectrum. In 1975, he technically passed away for 35 minutes after a severe episode, but was miraculously revived by doctors. It was a warning sign from the universe, but tragically, the grip of addiction was too strong to break. By 1976, Paul was attempting a comeback with a new band, Backstreet Crawler. He was trying to regain his footing in the world, touring America and hoping to find the spark that had made him a legend. However, his body was exhausted. On March 19, 1976, Paul boarded a flight from Los Angeles to New York. He seemed to be in good spirits, chatting with those around him. But as the plane cruised over the Atlantic, Paul fell into a sleep from which he would not wake. He suffered a pulmonary embolism, a direct consequence of his weakened physical state. The flight crew discovered that the 25-year-old star had quietly slipped away at 30,000 feet. The news was greeted with a wave of sorrow back in Britain. His father, David Kossoff, later established a foundation in his son's name to help fight the scourge of addiction, turning his private grief into a public crusade. Paul's death was not just the loss of a musician, it was the loss of a unique voice that has never been replicated. He did not need 1,000 notes to impress an audience, he needed only one, played with enough feeling to stop time. Today, Paul Kossoff is remembered as the tragic angel of the blues. His grave is marked with a simple plaque, but his legacy lives on every time All Right Now plays on the radio. He serves as a poignant reminder that immense talent often comes with immense fragility, and that sometimes the people who bring the most joy to the world are the ones suffering the most in silence. Nick Drake. In the noisy, flamboyant landscape of the 1970s, where success was measured in decibels and glitter, there was one artist who whispered instead of shouting. The story of Nick Drake is perhaps the most poignant example of the misunderstood genius in British cultural history. Born into an upper-middle-class family and educated at Cambridge University, Nick was a tall, handsome young man who seemed to have every advantage in life. He possessed a guitar technique that was utterly unique and a voice that sounded like autumn leaves falling on a quiet street. However, behind his gentle demeanor lay a paralyzing shyness and a deepening melancholy that would eventually consume him completely. He was not built for the cutthroat world of the music business. He was a poet who simply wanted his songs to be heard, but the world was not ready to listen. During his short career, Nick released 3 albums: 5 Leaves Left, Brighter Later, and Pink Moon. Today, these records are considered masterpieces, treasured by millions of fans and cited as influences by the biggest bands in the world. But in the early 1970s, they were commercial failures. They sold fewer than 5,000 copies upon release. Nick, who was desperate for connection, took this indifference as a personal rejection. He refused to give interviews or perform live, retreating further into his own shell. His final album, Pink Moon, recorded in 2 short nights, is a stark, stripped-back document of a mind unraveling. It is just a man and his guitar, stripping away all the layers until only the raw, painful truth remained. By 1974, the 26-year-old musician had abandoned London and retreated to his parents' home, a secluded house called Farleigh in the Warwickshire countryside. He had ceased to function as a professional artist. Friends described him as unrecognizable. He would sit for hours in silence, staring at the wall, trapped in a fortress of inner darkness. He felt like a failure, a burden to his family, and a ghost in his own life. It is heartbreaking to imagine a man of such immense talent sitting in a small room, believing that his art meant nothing to anyone. On the morning of November 25, 1974, his mother went into his room to wake him, only to find him lying across his bed. He had passed away during the night from an overdose of a prescribed antidepressant called triptazole. To this day, it remains a mystery whether it was a deliberate decision to leave this world or a tragic accident caused by a desperate need for sleep. There was no note, only a book on his bedside table about the myth of Sisyphus. He was just 26 years old. At the time of his passing, his death was barely noticed by the music press. The true tragedy of Nick Drake is the irony of his afterlife. Decades later, His music was used in a car commercial, sparking a global revival that turned him into an icon. Today, his grave is a site of pilgrimage, and his records sell more copies in a month than they did in his entire lifetime. He achieved the immortality he craved, but he was not there to see it. His story serves as a somber lesson about the fragility of artists and the importance of kindness. We will never know what other songs he had inside him, only that the world was too loud for such a quiet soul. Ian Curtis. For our final story, we travel to the grey, industrial streets of Manchester to meet a young man whose shadow looms larger than perhaps any other figure in British alternative music. Ian Curtis, the enigmatic frontman of Joy Division, was the poet laureate of urban decay. In the late 1970s, while others were screaming in anger, Ian was looking inward, exploring the desolate landscapes of the human soul with a baritone voice that sounded like it came from the bottom of a well. On stage, his performance was mesmerizing and frightening. He would dance with a frantic, jerky intensity that mirrored the epileptic seizures he suffered from in real life. To the audience, it was art. To Ian, it was a physical manifestation of the loss of control that defined his existence. Behind the brooding mystique lay a 23-year-old man who was rapidly losing his grip on reality. Ian had been diagnosed with severe epilepsy at a time when the medical treatment for the condition was primitive and brutal. The heavy medication he was prescribed caused extreme mood swings, leaving him in a state of constant exhaustion and depression. He was trapped in a vicious cycle. The flashing lights of the stage triggered his seizures, yet the stage was the only place where he felt truly alive. Furthermore, his personal life was collapsing under the weight of his own guilt. He was torn between his loyalty to his wife, Deborah, and their baby daughter, and an intense affair with a Belgian journalist named Annick. The lyrics he wrote during this period, particularly for the song "Love Will Tear Us Apart," were not just artistic expressions, they were literal cries for help, documenting the disintegration of his spirit. By May 1980, Joy Division was on the brink of global stardom. They were scheduled to fly to America for their first transatlantic tour, a journey that would likely have made them household names. But for Ian, the prospect of the tour was not an opportunity. It was a terrifying sentence. He was petrified that his health would not hold up, that he would let everyone down, and that he could no longer maintain the facade of the rock star. On the evening of May 17th, he returned to his home in Macclesfield to persuade his estranged wife to drop the divorce proceedings. When she left, he spent the night alone, watching a film by Werner Herzog called Stroszek and listening to The Idiot by Iggy Pop. It was a lonely vigil in a quiet house, with the pressure of the world resting on his shoulders. In the early hours of May 18th, 1980, just hours before he was due to board the plane to New York, Ian Curtis made the tragic decision to end his pain. He was found later that morning by his wife, having taken his own life in the kitchen. He was only 23. The news stopped the British music world in its tracks. The band, which had been poised to conquer the world, immediately ceased to exist as Joy Division, eventually reforming as New Order. The tragedy of Ian Curtis is the ultimate story of the tortured artist, but it is also a story about the failure of the medical and support systems of the 1970s. He was a young man dealing with a neurological disease and profound depression, treated with pills that made him worse, and pushed into a spotlight that burned him. His tombstone in Macclesfield bears the inscription of his most famous song title. Every time we hear that haunting synthesizer melody, we are reminded of the fragile boy who gave everything he had to the music until he had nothing left to give to himself. His passing marked the definitive end of the 70s post-punk era and the beginning of a darker, more introspective decade.